how are you feeling about the Titans receivers now for fantasy purposes after this move?
I'm actually kind of intrigued. And you know what? As somebody who's like dabbled in curiosity regarding Will Levis, who like big bodied guy, like underrated mobility as a big quarterback here. I actually think like this entire way that the Titans have approached this offseason has been a huge, huge win for Will Levis, who I actually think is like probably a late round quarterback target, at least as it stands today. They've made investments in the offensive line. They're surrounding him with weapons. And I think suddenly when you look at this team, you say, even if I have an aging DeAndre Hopkins, I have Calvin Ridley, who, I wasn't convinced he could be a wide receiver one, but when you're lining up opposite of DeAndre Hopkins, that kind of changes the narrative a little bit. Suddenly you have Treylon Burks, who I still think has plenty of upside. I think what the Titans need to do, move him back to the slot, which is where he thrived in college. It doesn't seem natural, that he would be a slot receiver because of his size, but that is where he thrived. And I think taking the load off him as forcing him to be an X receiver just because of his size, like that's not what he does. That's not his game. I think this is a win for the entire offense, but Calvin Ridley in general, he's kind of an interesting one, right? Like he's a very interesting player, and I don't necessarily know how I feel about him specifically for fantasy. Ranked 49th with 0.36 fantasy points per route run, ranked 54th in fantasy points per target, was a wide receiver 18 last year. Like, you know, I don't know. It's hard because he's not going to be a guy that I think is going to consistently win you weeks, especially with the number of weapons they have. And for as much as I do think that the addition of him helps Will Levis, you still have the question mark of Will Levis, who has a ginormous arm and can definitely connect on some big plays with Calvin Ridley. I think the only question, and this has been kind of a predominant one throughout Ridley's career, is can he manage the consistency aspect?
Yeah, that's been definitely an issue for Calvin Ridley, and somebody that, again, like you mentioned last year, not quite what fantasy managers were hoping for. Like you said, wide receiver 18, but he's kind of done this more from a volume standpoint than anything. He stayed healthy. He played, pretty much every game. I think every game last year, and it was able to rack up production that way. But I think, as far as hoping for that wide receiver one upside on a weekly basis, it was far from that. So when I look at him now joining Tennessee, I think I'm relatively optimistic that Will Levis can be a good NFL quarterback, but I don't know that it's,
But we still don't know.
Yeah,
Like we have no idea.
That's the thing, right? There's huge question marks about it. Like there was moments last year, but then there was also a lot of stuff where you're like, okay, this could be, where he's at in his NFL career, not necessarily ever a top 12 guy or anything like that, but now there's weapons at least for him to be productive. And like you said, I like it for Will Levis as a potential late round quarterback for fantasy purposes, just because of the weapons around him. But whether he can sustain fantasy relevance for guys like Hopkins, Ridley, Burks, as all three of them, I have less, I guess, confidence in. And for Ridley specifically, I'm not like a huge Calvin Ridley fan. I wasn't heading into last year either. So I just can't see myself being too excited for him this year once I kind of put my rankings together. I think he could be fine for NFL purposes. Like you said, there's not that wide receiver one expectation for him in Tennessee, but as the wide receiver two in that Tennessee offense, what that looks like for fantasy purposes, I guess I'm not as optimistic about it. And he's just been somebody that hasn't delivered above expectations or even close to expectations the past two seasons that he's played. And that's kind of where I come down on Calvin Ridley, and I have a hard time seeing myself drafting him again this year.
I'll say he's going to be a guy that I probably have on a lot of best ball teams, and
Mhm.
that's probably where I'm going to leave him.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's fine because we talked about it a lot last year. We were doing the previews, right? Like the frustration of having to decide when and when not to start Calvin Ridley was real. And we saw that in his numbers, and looking at, again, like fantasy points versus expectations last year. He was a negative 34.6, tied for 8th among wide receivers. We saw that the year prior when he was with Atlanta as well. It was I think he led the league as the lowest fantasy points over expectations for that season as well. So again, more of a volume guy. How much volume there's going to be in that Tennessee passing offense, we'll have to see. But I can't imagine it's a high ceiling there for passing offense.